going to share with us this evening insights into the book in the early modern period in his talk Tatters and Patches in Early Modern England, Finding Old Texts in New Books. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real honour to be here to talk to you for the first annual Colclough lecture in the history of the book. And it's an honour because Stephen Colclough was a book historian and a literary scholar whose work I admire and I continue to learn from all the time. And it's also an honour, as Sue hinted at just then, because Stephen was a close friend. And 2.5 years after his death, I still often feel that I'm working and living in the shadow of his absence. Whether that's because I discussed his publications in seminars with MA students at Oxford, as we frequently do, or because my phone still has his text messages from 2015. And thinking about today's event took me back to Stephen's superb Consuming Texts, Readers and Reading Communities from 2007, which lots of you will know, where we can see playing out Stephen's sense that in order to understand a reader, we need to draw on as wide a range of sources as possible: diaries, commonplace books, extant libraries, records of book clubs, reading societies, albums of excerpts written with goose quills, printed books covered in scribbled annotations. This is clearly a Colcloughian project, if we can put it like that. And we see his humour, which in Consuming Texts takes the form of a capacity to notice the surprising, the curious, the bit of text that resists the model. We see his political instincts in a distrust of the monolithic, a delight in the various, his natural sympathy for the underdog, the outlier, the unrepresented. And we see him also in that expansive interest the book enacts, in new questions, areas for research, new kinds of reader. And Consuming Texts ends with a sketch of topics that Stephen might have worked on next, and it's both modest in that it's a concession of what he hasn't explored, and ambitious in the sense of prospect it offers. Immigrant reading communities, readers who spoke little or no English, working class readers of Welsh and Gaelic. Now I want to start today with an archival moment that I know Stephen would have relished. One of those occasions when you were expecting one thing to come along in the library you're working on, but something else appears and your sense of the order of things slightly shifts. The Cry and Revenge of Blood, as you can see up here, is an account of the murder by a man named Norton of 3 members of the Leeson family. It was written by clergyman Thomas Cooper, who signs the preface "From my house in Whitecross, this 24th of August 1620. Now, Cooper attended the trial and kept notes, which he then turned up, narrativized, into this account here. And the text is richly informed by the language of theatre, but it's also a clergyman's work of theodicy, an attempt to justify the ways of God in the face of a terrible event. Cooper describes the details of this murder in order to assert, quote, the providence of God in permitting and ordering such horrible wickedness. And this quarto's text title page, as you can see, has a large illustration of the crime, the murderer urged on by a satanic figure, and the work's designed to display the nature and heinousness of willful murder. So I wanted to read this text. There will be lots of reasons to read this text, I think. So I ordered in the Bodleian Library, where I was working, which has 2 copies. So as any historian of the book should do, I ordered both copies to look at them both. And the first one that came to my desk, first thing that appeared was a text in a limp vellum binding that upon opening revealed not 1 but 6 titles, 6 texts contained in the same binding. In other words, a sammelband, an anthology of related texts created by a reader who bought unbound texts with some governing thematic or generic consistency in mind and then gathered them together into a single volume. A characteristic mode of early modern textual organisation, richly described recently by Geoffrey Todd Knight in his book about the practice. Now, many libraries in the 19th century, like the British Library, for example, separate these sammelband collections out into discrete units because they're preoccupied with the idea of a text needing to be an individual material, physical thing. But other libraries, including the Bodleian, left things as they were generally, and so we can still confront these texts in the sammelband collection anthology form in which they circulated in the early modern period in little clusters put together by readers, one text grafted onto another. And if we look at some of the titles in this particular anthology, we can quickly see an organising logic. The Cry and Revenge of Blood is the final text in a bloody corpus that includes the other murder pamphlets you can see listed here. So I was expecting one text, but I got 6. And this immediately raises questions about the relationship between Cooper's text, the one I thought I was going to be reading, and the other text that travelled with it, the other partners in crime. The edges of Cooper's work dissolve, we might say, or at least they become a little more permeable. And the bibliographical form in our hand, the Sammelband, inclines us probably to read intertextually, to think about the connections between the texts that are gathered in this single anthology, with a sense that a modern preoccupation with the autonomy of the literary work, of its excluding bibliographical and aesthetic perimeters, doesn't serve us well if we're reading this particular variety of anthology, of collection. So that's the first copy of The Cry and Revenge of Blood I encountered. Ordering the second copy brings to my desk something stranger still. What appears is not a book at all, but a box, a leather-covered wooden box with a separate lid, about 13 by 9 centimetres, with slits in the leather, suggesting maybe it was attached to something, maybe a belt, something else at one point in its past. And the book's interior, as you can see, has been lined with portions of 2 leaves from Cooper's Cry and Revenge, as you can see here, page 38 and page 29 for the lid and then for the inside. An instance, we might say, of decoupage, the decorating of an object with paper cutouts. Before that term was coined, actually the history of decoupage is interesting. The OED's first usage of the term, from the French to cut up or out, comes from a 1960 account of the decoration of 17th century fans, suggesting the lively early modern presence of a practice with a 20th century name. Now, the date of the box isn't clear, but the printed leaves suggest probably sometime around 1620. That's when the text is published. The library card that accompanies the box records in the deadpan cadence of the cataloguer that this text object was, quote, discovered in the rare books section F-floor dump in 1995. So this rendering of Cooper, then, is a box, but it's also a text, albeit a text in which the status of the printed word is not clear. What should we do with this object? How should we respond? Should we read the parts of the murder story we can see? Should we locate the larger whole from where these parts came? What's the relationship between text and box? Does the genre and subject matter of the text, a kind of conflation of the devotional and the sensational, suggest something of the original purpose of the box, or is this a chance collision, expressive of nothing more than the waste paper to hand? Where is the rest of this copy of Cooper's text? How does one read a box? So I ordered a single pamphlet, and instead I was presented with 2 forms that immediately demand that I rethink my assumptions about the kind of presence in the world that Cooper's Cry and Revenge enjoyed. And the encounter was, at the very least, a reminder of what we might call the regularly exceptional nature of early modern print culture, an example of the capacity of text to assume new forms after their moment of publication, and a warning that scholarship that doesn't observe this kind of material strangeness represents a kind of falling short, I think, in the face of early modern book culture. I've been working recently on ways in which 16th and 17th century books were always works in progress, conceptually and materially in flux. And I've been trying to attend to features of the material text that I think have been a bit under-examined by critics. So I've been exploring the paradoxical culture of knives and scissors in which books were cut up, not in a spirit of censorship, but as a form of careful reading. And I've been thinking about the links between books and book destruction in a culture which valued the transience of print. And I've been thinking a little bit about the importance of errors, the literary and cultural richness of making mistakes in print. And also, and this is what I'll be talking about today, the recycling, if that's the term we can use, of older, often lost printed texts in the bodies of new books in the form of printed waste, the ways in which older texts live on in newer publications. And in this broader project, I'm trying to recover these bibliographical cultures and so modify our sense of what a book might be. And I'm also interested in thinking about how writers responded to this particular sense of the book as cut, burnt, error-filled, recycled. Partly because the eagerness with which writers reflected on the materiality of text and thought about and represented just what a strange and shifting thing a book was in this period. I think it's one of the striking features of literary culture in the 16th and 17th century, and beyond that too, but that's my focus today. Writers like Herbert, Vaughan, Cavendish, Margaret Cavendish, Thomas Nash, John Milton, Ben Jonson, lots more. So I'll be thinking about old books recycled in new books today, and the consequences of that kind of looping, haunted temporality. And my focus is on 16th, 17th century England, but the culture of waste I'm describing can help us again, I think, about terms such as historicism, context, and period. So I'll talk through a couple of examples of printed waste now, and then I'll try and pull out 4 or 5 implications, 4 or 5 reasons why I think they're worth thinking about and are not trivial features of book culture. And then I'll finish by briefly looking at a poem which engages in an interesting way with what I'm talking about, I hope. By recycled waste, I mean pieces of earlier texts, very literally, used in the physical structure of new books. Waste used as binding supports, for example, or in the pasteboards or as end leaves. Now, the waste might come from books that were once in circulation, books that have been torn or cut up, and this is sometimes called binder's waste. Or the waste might come from what's sometimes called printer's waste, the unused sheets lying around a print office that never had a life in a finished book form. Proof sheets, for example, or cancelled pages, or used frisket sheets, or pages carrying serious misprints known as spoils, often unfolded since they never constituted a book in a codex form. And crucially, and amazingly, interestingly, I think, this is the thing that got me thinking about this, the waste is overwhelmingly legible. We can still see it. It's not buried away. It's not hidden out of a sense of shame. This is an example I'll come back to a bit later on. Shakespeare's First Folio, 1623 in the Bodleian, and the boards have paste downs made from sheets cut from a late 15th century printed edition of Cicero's On Duties. Now, recycled printed waste usually comes from the kind of short shelf-life text we might expect. Last year's almanac, most frequently, or a royal proclamation about cloth, or sometimes, and rivetingly, for literary scholars, a fragment of a corrected proof sheet. So there's a fragment of the corrected proof sheet to Milton's Lycidas in the Cambridge University Library, used as waste in a later binding. Some books, paradoxically, only survive because they served as waste. Like this one, which is William Bass's Great Britain Sunset, which is an elegy for the death of Henry, Prince of Wales, printed in 1613. And as lots of you will know, Prince Henry's death in 1612 was the cause, it seems, of near universal, or at least the performance of near universal literary and cultural woe. And Bass's text offers 19 rather wearying stanzas of lament before concluding with 2 final verses that turn from Henry towards the new Prince of Wales, his younger brother Charles. And that turn, as always in elegy, is the stress point of the poem, the most exacting moment of composition, when the gloom of death has to pivot to meet the fact of the next in line with something like optimism. Henry's dead, which is bad, but now there is Charles, which is good. And Bass slides from mourning with a U to mourning without a U, from doom to daybreak, to look forward to a new era. And you can see this at the start of stanza 21, a morning after morning. Let me no longer press your gentle eyes, being of themselves frank of religious tears. Bass's text seems not to have met with appreciative readers, and it survives today only as printed waste. If we go to the University Library at Cambridge, we can find that pieces have been extracted from bindings to reconstitute a kind of monstrous whole. So these are bits from lots of copies that were used as waste that have been regathered, removed from the host to patch together this new book. Or we can see bits. It looks like I'm tearing this off, but it's very careful, I can assure you what I'm doing. We can glimpse pieces that remain in situ today. And on the left there's a book in Lincoln College Library, which is a collection of pamphlets bound together in one whole. That's that Samuel band structure again, all concerned with scripture, the English liturgy, first decade of the 17th century, and the paste downs at the back have a sheet of Latin prose, and then underneath that, visible because the glue has failed, and only because the glue has failed, stanzas 16 and 21 from Bass's poem. You can just see a morning after morning lurking unread for 400 years underneath. Let me no longer press your gentle eyes. So I want to take a slightly closer look at two particular examples of this culture of waste. Think about why they might be worth thinking about or with. My first example, this is Francis Bacon's The History of the Reign of King Henry VII from 1622. It's Bacon's, it's in St Edmund Hall College Library, St Edmund Hall Library. It's Bacon's history, Francis Bacon's history of the first Tudor monarch, written soon after Bacon's impeachment in 1621, shaped in part by Tacitus and Livy, but drawing too on manuscripts supplied by Sir Robert Cotton, and written with a sense of history as something like a film that might be layered over the contemporary. And looking closely, one realises, as so often, that this book is a torrent of copy specificity, particulars that both anchor the book in its singularity, but that also make the book baffling, something both in our hands and beyond our reach. It's also a book with printed waste in it, as you can see here, the front and here at the back. So what are we looking at if we look a bit closer? Well, these are printed sheets that are used to strengthen the binding of the book. And if we look a bit closer, we can perhaps begin to make out the text. And here, zoomed in on the right, is the bottom of the waste at the front of the book. Chapter 23 foretelleth the destruction of how great calamities, signs of his coming to. It doesn't take long to realise that this is Matthew chapter 23. And looking carefully at the rest of the waste shows that collectively the waste covers passages from Matthew 22, 23, 24, 27 and 28. That is the description of Christ speaking to the multitudes and castigating the scribes and Pharisees as hypocrites. And in 27 and 28, the plaiting of the crown of thorns, the crucifixion, the rolling back of the stone from the tomb, and the news that Christ has risen. This is the text that's used here as to support the physical form of the book in Bacon's history. We can also see that when we look at the kind of whole strip of waste, the front, that the waste comes from unfolded sheets from an octavo edition of the King James Bible. That is, sheets that never made it into a coherent, bound Bible for some reason. And we know that there are 13 octavo editions of the King James Bible before 1622, when the Bacon book is published. So I was wondering if you could work out which particular edition seems to have supplied this waste. And if you track through all of these, comparing the extant waste with these different editions, you can see a series of small discrepancies, just to give it a sense. So here's the printed waste on the top from Matthew 23. If I just go back a bit. So this is the front waste on the left-hand side, foretelleth the destruction of, and then the other side, the temp, as in temple. And if we start to compare these against images from different editions, this is the 1612 octavo edition of the King James. If you just focus on the word temple on the end of the first line, you can see that that's not quite aligned. We do a bit more, and you have moments of excitement and then disappointment, and it looks like it's going to match. Not quite right. And you carry on in this strange way until you get to here, 1620, when you can see that the text matches the waste, and momentarily the world feels a tidier place. This is the 1622 octavo edition of the King James Bible. And not for the first time, actually, I'm reminded of what a strange version of reading often one performs as one tumbles down these bibliographical rabbit holes. The meticulous tracking between iterations of the same word fragments, the pivotal role played by parts of a text that might to anyone else seem marginal, the dash separating syllables. A reading that understands word less as conveyors of meaning and more as shapes, curls, loops, stubby straight lines, empty or largely empty of semantic content. But I want to come back to that question later on, the question of whether these are marks or whether they are still words, whether they're material or whether they're still literary. So Bacon's book then carries within it parts of the King James Bible, as many books from the period carried pieces of earlier texts. Like many instances of waste, those tatters are partially legible. you can't help but noticing them. The binders made no effort to conceal them, it looks like, and you can, if you wish, if you think it appropriate, if you have time, read them, although what exactly reading means in those circumstances isn't entirely clear. Again, I'll come back to that, I hope. Okay, so that's the first example. Here's a second example. This is a book by the Regius Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge, Edward Lively, printed in 1597, a true chronology of the times of the Persian monarchy and after to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And when we open this particular copy of Lively's book, we see not only a title page, but facing that, parts of another text used as end papers. And amazingly, or at least to me, I was amazed initially, the waste comes from the second quarto of Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella, a book we probably know, a book literary critics used to organise histories of the period. The book, we're told, that kicked off the mania for sonnet sequences in late Elizabethan England, of which Shakespeare's is only one rather belated example. And facing Lively's title page is the top half of Sidney's Astrophel and Stella signature C2, sideways left to right, with the first three lines of what modern editors call, the last three lines rather, of what modern editors call sonnet 39 and all of sonnet 40, as good to write for as to lie and groan. And we see something similar at the back of the book. Lively's text concludes with one of my favourite forms, a list of errata, prefaced by a brief but typical to the gentle reader, written in the voice of the author. Gentle reader, I am to desire thee to amend with thy pen these escapes, etc., etc. And then facing this is the bottom half of Sidney's signature B2, sideways left to right, conveying sonnet 31. Your words, my friend, right healthful, caustics blame. And one other moment from the same book. In addition to bookending Lively's text, Sidney's sonnets also interrupt the codex. In the middle of Lively's book, next to a chronological table of the Greek Olympiads, a single line from the fold of Astrophel and Stella B2 tucks through at right angles to the main text, and maybe you can just make it out, that straight eye saw motions of lightning grace, it says. Now, the use of Astrophel and Stella as printed waste probably seems to us a bit surprising, given the cultural and literary significance we attach to a text that catalysed so many sonnet sequences in the 1590s. Why is it here? Why is it being used as waste? Why might that be the case? Well, perhaps the printers and readers of Lively's text were not the sort to be interested in a sequence of 108 Petrarchan sonnets plus songs. The waste functioning here as a useful reminder that different reading communities have and had a different sense of priorities, even within the same year. The binder may have regarded Sidney's 1591 text as obsolete due to William Ponsonby's publication in 1598 of the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia in folio, which included the poems. In the early modern period, a new edition often rendered obsolete an earlier edition, even if we today value that earlier edition as a vital text in its own right. So when Shakespeare's third folio arrived at the Bodleian in 1664, the Bodleian sold its first folio to the magnificently named Turbots of Ogston Hall, before buying the book back with a mixture of fanfare and awkwardness for £3,000 in the first decade of the 20th century. But the dismembering of a Sidney volume, if that's what is going on here, at the same time of his most intense popularity, is still striking, even with a new edition just out, and raises certain paradoxes, I think, about print popularity. The presence of Sidney's text as waste implies both a low cultural status, otherwise why tear it up, but also a high cultural status. Copies were everywhere, so one torn-up book wouldn't dent Sidney's presence. Confronting the Sidney and Endleaves troubles, in quite a profound way, our sense of the literary canon, suggesting we might be fundamentally out of tune with Elizabethan taste. But those end leaves also confirm our sense of the 1590s, when Sidney's text was everywhere fluttering through the air. And reading the waste, in this sense, is like overhearing fragments of a passing literary conversation in the street in 1598, in which reassuringly the speaker's coordinates are our literary coordinates. So Lively's book carries within it parts of Sidney's sonnets, as many books from the period did. And they're, as with the Bacon, legible here. What does this mean for readers and for critics? I'd like to suggest 5 brief consequences for this culture, this practice. First, this book, the one we have here, raises fundamental questions about what it is we are reading. Is this one book, or 2, or 1.5, or some other fraction? Where does the book begin and end? Where are its material and conceptual edges? Who is the author? Well, Edward Lively would seem to have a pretty good case, but the catalogue, the Bodleian, classifies this volume as Bod J.J. Sidney 173, that is, as a text within the Sidneyan corpus. A classification that tells us something of the pull of the canon and the way that tricky books, as we struggle to pin them down, reveal to us our own priorities, our own ideological investments. Is this a book of destruction or preservation? Does the Lively book keep alive fragments of Sidney we wouldn't otherwise have, or is this the record of loss? Is there too much book or not enough? Or should we approach the bibliographical object in front of us through a different interpretive paradigm altogether, reading Sidney's sonnets perhaps as the kind of local cluster we might find in manuscript miscellanies, where pools of sonnets are passed from manuscript to manuscript, and we've grown used to having little or no concern for finished wholes. And it's worth stressing that this unsettling materiality isn't an outlier moment in 16th and 17th century book culture, but I think dramatises a condition of all early modern reading, which is that reading is an engagement with bibliographical features that are hard to assimilate within the model of the finished, stable, clean, settled, coherent codex. That's the first implication. Second, when is this book's moment? When does it exist in time? A kind of commonsensical historicist literary criticism seeks to read a text in dialogue with its context, with its moment. But what does context mean here exactly? And historicist hermeneutics rest on the idea of a punctual temporal frame in which even the most flighty literary text can be embedded. But we have here several temporalities at once. Sidney's printed in 1591, Lively in 1598, the Waste and the Host are conjoined at some point after this. We don't exactly know when. And what's produced is a bibliographical object that complicates or thickens the historicism of the text. Third implication, the reader is made aware, I think, or at least I'm made aware, of the history of this book's production. A particular moment of bookmaking is suddenly recalled or implied. In 1598, the binder of Lively's Chronicle has a copy of the second quarter of Astrophel and Stella to hand. The book is for some reason deemed undesirable, superfluous, perhaps a reflection of the different reading communities of Lively's books and Sidney's, perhaps because of the recent publication of the Folio Sidney. The Sidneyan text is cut or torn to supply these end leaves. What isn't used in Lively supplies, presumably, another book's binding. So the mechanics of book production, usually effaced, hidden away from the reader, are momentarily lit up, and the reading can take place with an awareness of this context, this process of production. I noted earlier, thinking a little bit more about the kind of sudden illumination of the book-making process through moments of slippage or breakdown like this, if we can think of them as that. I noted earlier, Bodleian's first folio has this waste from printed Cicero. Now, we know a little bit, unusually, about because of the book and because of where it is, we know a little bit about the binding process of this volume, which we normally don't about books. Because we have a binder's book for this period, from 1621 to 1624, which contains lists of piles of books that were sent from the university to a number of local binders, with their signatures confirming receipt of the books, delivered to John Allen, bookbinder, June the 19th, 1621, etc. And the record for 17th of February 1624 records, delivered to William Wildgoose, which is a real name, William Wildgoose, these books following to be found. And there's a list of these books here. This is the book on the left with the transcription on the right. These books are delivered to William Wildgoose, and signature at the bottom, all to be bound by him as a sort of as a single order. Now, 4 of these titles, the ones in bold, today in the library carried printed waste from parts of the same single copy of Cicero. And one of them is the Shakespeare one that we saw earlier. So this continuity of waste, which we normally can't recover because you don't have a record of the binder and which books he worked on at a single moment, this continuity of waste puts these books back for a moment in Wild Goose's print shop, as Wild Goose or his employee performs a curious parody of reading, moving through the Cicero text, turning the leaves if bound or the sheets if not, evaluating the text, but evaluating it in terms of its material rather than its aesthetic or literary properties, presumably, and responding to approved sections by removing or tearing out sheets. Not what is Cicero saying here about duty, but is this sheet large enough, tough enough for the purpose? Now, in retaining legible printed waste, the Wild Goose Shakespeare is rare among first folios. Of the 232 extant copies of Shakespeare's book, only 2 others contain similar printed waste. And I think that's probably because most copies of the first folio were lavishly rebound as a kind of an act of honour in the late 18th century onwards. And any waste in the original binding would have been removed. But the particular history of that Bodleian first folio, when it was sold off and then shamefully kind of bought back from private ownership, is probably the reason why the waste is preserved. It explains the lack of intervention. So that's the third implication, that we can get a sense of the bookmaking process in these moments of waste. So we can see behind the scenes, as it were. Fourth implication of 5. What kind of a relationship can we propose between Sidney and Lively? Is there a kind of Darwinian literary history playing out here as Lively's text gobbles up Sidney's? Or is that inappropriately competitive? And perhaps it's better to think about an ecological discourse of waste and host and the dependency that that language implies, the sense of a climate larger than a single work. Now, the 17th century biographer and antiquarian John Aubrey can, as so often, help us out here. When Aubrey wrote his very brief autobiography, alongside the many other brilliant vignettes, brief lives of his peers, for which he's famous, he scribbled across the top of his manuscript of his own life to be interponed as a sheet of waste paper only in the binding of a book. Now, to be interponed means to be placed between. So Aubrey is imagining his written life being used as waste to strengthen the physical construction of another book. And I wonder what he meant by this exactly. How playful was he being? And what does it mean to imagine your written life as binding waste? Aubrey's prescription might be a straightforward statement of modesty of a slightly histrionic kind, which he was given to. He described himself as a whetstone against which others sharpen their wits. And in some ways that's kind of consistent with what's going on here. But the image is more complicated than that, I think. To bind one's life in another book means not only assuming an obscured second place, it also means helping to instantiate another book, supporting another book into being. It means placing one's text alongside another in sociable company with the possibility of dialogue and relationship. And it means, crucially, being preserved, banking on posterity. And I think Aubrey was deeply interested in the longue durée, holding out for a future when one's critical stock might be higher and readers might invert the apparent priority of waste and host. So I think it's a complicated clause that he offers in this throwaway manner. So fifth, final implication. The presence of waste causes the reader, or at least causes me, to pause, to wonder about the nature and the scope of reading. What are we supposed to do interpretatively with the thing that we're looking at? Should we turn the book and read Sidney's sonnets as fragments of a lost literary work? Is this what early modern readers did? I still don't know the answer to that question. The presence of the single line from what later editors would call Sonnet 20, this bit here, this kind of Delphic, compelling Delphic utterance, but straight I saw motions of lightning's grace, as a shard emerging from the gutter at right angles, is beguiling or affecting, particularly actually in the very recent context of artists' books and work on the manipulation of the physical book that's happened this kind of chance concatenation comes alive in that context, I think. It's beguiling or affecting, but it's affecting, I think, in the way that any chance concatenation, like the juxtapositions created by switching randomly between radio stations, can be powerful. But there is an interesting tension here, I think, and there's a reason to pause before saying simply it's chance or there's no interpretative life to those words. The example of Astrophel and Stella is intriguing because in order to function as waste, Sidney's text is being asked to forget itself as literary text, to stop being a literary text, and to become instead a merely or entirely material prop. So its early modern role in Lively's book is to help physically support and preserve a true chronology, to pad it out, to physically make it up, and to be drained of all its sonnetness in pursuit of that physical structure. But that transformation from text to waste, that process of emptying out of signification, is only partially successful. There's a sort of refusal on the part of the Sidneyan waste to conform entirely to its new role, as the poem remains legible, as we want to read those lines and think about them, as we give the lively text a Sidneyan call number. And the result, I think, is a kind of flickering between these two conditions of waste, the waste as material and as literary, a sort of hesitancy between those two states. It's being asked to work as a material prop. It's still legible as a literary poem, and so it kind of flickers between those two roles. Now, in 1655, Henry Vaughan's poem, The Book, was printed, which some of you will know, and I think in compelling ways reflects on a culture of book reuse that I've been describing. Reflects on this, on a sense of the long life of paper, of the book in your hand having a prehistory that goes back a long way, and the sense of a book as a recent, maybe even temporary arrangement of materials that once served other roles, earlier functions. The book as a kind of alignment for the time being of these materials that might assume other forms, and that did in the past assume other forms. In his poem, Henry Vaughan's poem, The Book, Vaughan describes reading a Bible as a haptic process of handling a book, an experience of touching. And through that encounter with materiality, Vaughan suggests, we are able to glimpse the past lives of the physical components of the book. So the leather binding of the book was years before the skin of an animal, he says, an animal that lived and ate and slept. And something of the life of that animal continues to travel with the book through time. And the boards of the book were once a tree, or came from a tree, and the pages were linen that covered the book, the backs of people who really lived. And reading the material text becomes a series of lunges back into this past. These kind of past material lives are suddenly brought alive in front of us. So here are a few lines of Vaughan's rather brilliant poem, where Vaughan is addressing God. Thou knewest this paper when it was mere seed, and after that but grass, before 'twas dressed or spun, and when made linen, who did wear it then? What were their lives, their thoughts and deeds, whether good corn or fruitless weeds? Thou knewest this harmless beast, looking at the binding of the book, when he did live and feed by thy decree on each green thing, then slept well fed, clothed with this skin, which now lies spread a covering o'er this aged book, which makes me wisely weep and look on my own dust. Mere dust it is, but not so dry and clean as this. So the book in Vaughan's poem is a record, is among other things, a record of lives lived in the past, not only human lives either. The pathos at the sense of past lives lost is balanced by the physical book's capacity to gather and preserve pieces of animate life that would otherwise have gone forever. Vaughan is here recognising a real material feature of books, a real literal feature of books, that books were patched from materials that were once other things, and that those former lives are often legible. And Vaughan, because he's a poet, takes this fact, this bibliographical fact, and runs with it for metaphysical effect, realizing with humility that he too is only dust, the same dust that composes a book, a commingling of subject and object. And the book reminds the speaker that they will both one day pass. And one thing that Vaughan realized, and that I hope my examples today have suggested, is that the coherent, bound, unannotated, fixed, complete printed book was not the dominant medium for conveying text. The establishment of a sense of the monumentality of the book, of its capacity to fix texts, to endure through time, has been one of the loudest narratives of 17th century literary culture. It's a narrative that has traditionally found crucial coordinates in the folio works of Ben Jonson in 1616 and William Shakespeare in 1623, among others, of course. But early modern books are embodied through an imperfect or excessive or ragged materiality. They are several pamphlets roughly bound together. They are printed books covered in handwritten annotations. They are quartos bedecked with errata lists and glued-in corrections. They are books held together by waste. And I think we need to attend to these features with specificity if we are to talk about the early modern book. Thank you very much.
Are you happy to take some questions?
No. Yes.
Okay.